Although Lee's ready acceptance of the role of attacker seemed to indicate otherwise, the odds were decidedly with Meade. Sedgwick's arrival completed the concentration of the Army of the Potomac, which remained some 80,000 strong after deductions for stragglers and yesterday's casualties. Lee, on the other hand, with Pickett's division and 6 of the 7 cavalry brigades still absent, had fewer than 50,000 effectives on the field after similar deductions. Moreover, the tactical deployment of the two forces extended these 8-5 odds considerably. Meade's 51 brigades of infantry and 7 of cavalry were available for the occupation of 3 miles of line, which gave him an average of 27,000 men per mile, or better than 15 to the yard, roughly twice as heavy a concentration as the Confederates had enjoyed at Fredericksburg. Whereas Lee's 34 brigades of infantry and 1 of cavalry were distributed along a 5-mile semicircle for an average of 10,000 men to the mile, or fewer than 6 per yard. As for artillery, Meade had 354 guns and Lee 272, or 118 to the mile as compared to 54. Nor were numbers the whole story. If the attacker enjoyed the advantage of being able to mass his troops for a sudden strike from a point of his choice along the extended arc, this was largely offset by the defender's advantage of being able to rush his ample reserves along the chord of that arc, first to bolster the threatened point and then to counterattack. So that the problem for Lee was not only to achieve a penetration, but also to maintain it afterwards in order to exploit it, which might prove an even greater difficulty. What was more, as he had warned Ewell the evening before, any thinning of the circumferential line to provide a striking force elsewhere would expose the weakened sector to being swamped and broken by the kind of powerful assault Meade could launch, more or less at will, from his interior lines. In short, if Sickles had exposed his 2 divisions to possible destruction by his occupation of the salient, the same might be said of Lee in the light of all this with regard to his whole army and the manner in which he had disposed it. Longstreet had discerned a good deal of this at first glance. At any rate, he'd recognized the potentials of disaster, even though he had no access to figures comparing the tactical strengths of the 2 armies. The 2 positions were there to look at, Meade's and Lee's, and the only thing he liked about the latter was that it could be abandoned without much trouble. When Lee declined his suggestions that the Confederates move around the Federal left and take up a similar position of their own, thus reversing the present assignment of roles, old Peter was dismayed. Failure by Hill and Ewell to complete the victory by driving the blue fugitives from the heights they'd fallen back on, which was his second choice as a proper course of action, only increased his despondency. It would have been better had we not fought at all than to have left undone what we did, he had said the night before in response to a staff officer's exuberance over the day's success. Renewing his plea for a withdrawal this morning, the burly Georgian had been rebuffed again, whereupon he turned sulky. Though he had, of course, obeyed all orders given him, he had not anticipated them in the best tradition of the Army of Northern Virginia, with the result that he was partly to blame for the delays encountered in the course of the unreconnoitered flank march. As it approached its close, however, his spirits rose, as they always did in proximity to the enemy. Above all, by a sort of extension, if not reversal, of his native stubbornness, he was determined to carry out Lee's orders to the letter. Just how determined Longstreet was in this respect was demonstrated to McLaws and Hood shortly after they halted their divisions in wooded jump-off positions due west of the Peach Orchard and the Devil's Den. McLaws rode forward, then dismounted, and walked to the edge of the woods about a quarter of a mile from the Emmitsburg Road for a look at the ground over which his troops would be advancing. There, in plain sight, he saw 2 blue divisions, one posted north along the road and the other southeast in the direction of the Round Tops. The view presented astonished me, he later recalled, as the enemy was massed in my front and extended to my right and left as far as I could see. Whatever validity they might have had when they were conceived 2 miles away and something over 5 hours ago, Lee's plans for an attack up the Emmitsburg Road in order to get astride the upper end of Cemetery Ridge were obviously no longer practicable. Not only was the Union left not overlapped, as had been presupposed, but McLaws would be exposing his flank to end-on fire if he attacked in accordance with instructions. He notified Longstreet of this turn of events, only to be told that the orders were not subject to alteration. "There is no one in your front but a regiment of infantry and a battery of artillery," the staff man who brought this message informed him. McLaws replied that he knew better, having seen with his own eyes what was out there. But this had no effect. 3 times he protested, and 3 times he was told to attack as ordered. The same was true of Hood. Never in his military life had this sad-eyed, blond young giant requested a modification of an order to attack. But he took one look at the situation and reacted much as McLaws was doing half a mile to the north. Before protesting, however, he sent out scouts to search for an alternative to what appeared to him to be a suicidal venture. They promptly found one. All the country south of the Round Tops was unoccupied, they reported. Meade's far left was wide open to just such an attack as Lee had contemplated. So Hood sent word to Longstreet that it was unwise to attack up the Emmitsburg Road as ordered, and requested instead that he be allowed to turn Round Top and attack the enemy in flank and rear. Longstreet's reply, based, as he said later, on Lee's repeated earlier refusal to permit any maneuver around the enemy left, was brief and to the point. General Lee's orders are to attack up the Emmitsburg Road. Supposing there must have been some misunderstanding, Hood repeated his request, and again his chief replied with that one sentence: "General Lee's orders are to attack up the Emmitsburg Road." By now Hood had been in position for nearly an hour, confronting the fissured tangle of the Devil's Den and the rocky frown of Little Round Top, and the longer he looked at what his men were being required to face, the more he became convinced that they were doomed. "In fact," he declared afterwards, "it seemed to me that the enemy occupied a position so strong, I may say impregnable, that independently of their flank fire, they could easily repel our attack by merely throwing or rolling stones down the mountainside as we approached." Once more he urged Longstreet to grant him freedom to maneuver, only to have old Peter deny him for still a 3rd time. General Lee's orders are to attack up the Emmitsburg Road. All that was lacking to complete the symbolism was a cockcrow. What came instead was a staff officer with peremptory instructions for him to go forward without delay. And while Hood was making last-minute adjustments in the alignment of his brigades, the Corps commander himself rode up. It was 4 o'clock. With his troops already in motion, Hood made a 4th and final appeal for permission to maneuver around Round Top for a strike at the open flank and rear of the Blue Army. Longstreet still would not agree, though he did at least change the wording of his one-sentence reply. "We must obey the orders of General Lee," he said. Lee's instructions called for the attack to be launched in echelon from right to left, not only by divisions, first Hood, then McLaws, and finally Anderson, with Pender alerted to strike in turn if additional pressure was needed, but also by the brigades within those divisions so that the attack would gather strength as it rolled northward. This meant that Law, on Hood's and therefore the Army's right, would be the first to step off, and so he did, promptly at 4 o'clock, but not as ordered. If Longstreet would not disregard or modify Lee's instructions, nor Hood Longstreet's, Law, a month short of his 27th birthday and next to the youngest of Lee's generals, had no intention of exposing first the flank and then the rear of his troops to the destructive fire of the Yankees in the Devil's Den, as would necessarily be the case if he advanced with his left aligned on the Emmitsburg Road. His unwillingness was not the result of any lack of courage, a quality he demonstrated on field after field, beginning with Gaines' Mill, where his brigade had charged alongside Hood's to break Fitzjohn Porter's apparently unbreakable triple line and give the Army of Northern Virginia its first victory. He would make whatever sacrifice was called for, but he saw that to advance as ordered would be to spill the blood of his 5 Alabama regiments to little purpose and with no chance of return. Consequently, in flat disobedience of orders, he charged due east in a frontal, not an oblique attack on the Devil's Den and Little Round Top itself, which he saw as the key to control of the field. J.B. Robertson's Texas Brigade conformed, being next in line, and the result, as Lee's far right and Meade's far left came to grips in that vine-laced maze of boulders and ravines, was more like Indian fighting, one participant would recall, than anything I experienced during the war. By the time Hood's other 2 brigades, both from Georgia and under Georgians, Henry O. Benning and G.T. Anderson, joined the melee in the Devil's Den, they found the conflict quite as confused as it was fierce. Hood was down, unhorsed by a shell fragment much as Heath had been the day before, except that he was struck in the arm and carried out of the battle on a stretcher. Such control as remained was on the company level or even lower. Every fellow was his own general, the Texan later wrote. Private soldiers gave commands as loud as the officers, nobody paying any attention to either. While this highly individualistic struggle was building toward a climax half a mile west of Little Round Top, Law gave 27-year-old William Oates instructions to veer southward with 2 regiments and flush a troublesome detachment of Union sharpshooters out of some woods at the foot of the steep northwest slope of Round Top. It was done in short order, though not without galling casualties, after which the 500 survivors continued their uphill charge, scrambling hand over hand around and across huge boulders and through heavy underbrush to call a halt at last on the lofty summit, panting for breath and wishing fervently that they had not sent their canteens off to be filled just before they received the order to advance. Unlike the lower conical hill immediately to the north, which had been cleared of timber in the fall and thus afforded an excellent all-round view of the countryside, this tallest of all the heights in Adams County, sometimes called Sugarloaf by the natives, was heavily wooded from base to crown, a condition detracting considerably from its tactical usefulness. Through the trees due north, however, just over 100 feet below and less than half a beeline mile away, Oates could see the barren, craggy dome of Little Round Top, deserted except for a handful of enemy signalmen busy wagging their long-handled flags, while off to the left on lower ground, smoke boiled furiously out of the rocks where the fight for the Devil's Den was raging at the tip of the left arm of the spraddled V drawn by sickles, its apex in the peach orchard and its right arm extending for the better part of a mile up the Emmitsburg Road, south and west of the main federal position along the upper end of Cemetery Ridge and on the dominant heights to the north and east, Bend and Bob of the Fishhook Meade had chosen to defend. All this lay before and below the young Alabama colonel, who continued to look it over while his troops were catching their breath on the crest of Round Top. Victory seemed as clear to him in his mind's eye as the town of Gettysburg itself, which he could see through the drifting smoke and the green fields rolling northward out of sight. He believed that with his present force he could hold this hilltop stronghold against a whole Yankee army, if necessary. So steep were the approaches on all sides, and if a battery of rifle guns could somehow be manhandled up here, piece by piece and part by part if need be, not a cranny of Meade's Fishhook line would be tenable any longer than it would take a detail of axemen to clear a narrow field of fire. So he believed. But just then a courier arrived from Law with instructions for him to push on and capture Little Round Top. Oates protested briefly, to no avail, then got his parched and weary men to their feet that had covered no less than 30 miles of road and mountainside since 3 o'clock that morning in New Guilford, and started them down the northern face of Round Top, intent on carrying out the order. It did not seem to him that this would be too difficult, particularly after he crossed the wooded valley between the Round Tops and was joined by a 3rd Regiment of Alabamians and 2 of Texans who had fought their way eastward through the lower fringes of the Devil's Den. Earlier, looking down from the taller of the 2 peaks, he had seen that the lower was not only undefended but also unoccupied, except by a handful of signalmen. And the confidence he derived from this was strengthened as the uphill march began and then continued without an indication that a single enemy rifleman stood or crouched among the rocks ahead. Two-thirds of the way up, however, as the butternut skirmishers approached a ledge that formed a natural bastion around the southwest face of the hill, a heavy volley of musketry exploded in their faces. Oates knew at once from the volume of fire, he afterwards described it as the most destructive he'd ever encountered, that it had been delivered by nothing less than a brigade, and probably a veteran one at that. This meant that he had a fight on his hands against troops in a position that afforded the same advantages he had contemplated enjoying in defense of the hilltop he just abandoned, under protest that he could hold it against all comers, with 2 regiments of about 500 badly winded men and no artillery at all. It was obvious here on Little Round Top, though, that a good many more men than that were shooting at him from the rocky ledge ahead, and what was more, they had artillery, 2 guns spraying canister from the crest above and beyond them. As soon as he could establish a firing line of his own, the 3 Alabama regiments on the right, the 2 Texas regiments on the left, Oates gave the order for an all-out uphill charge to drive the Federals back on their guns and off the mountaintop. That the Blue defenders had taken position on Little Round Top, even as Oates was on his way down from the companion height to seize it, was due to the vigilance and perception of one man, a staff brigadier who, strictly speaking, had no direct command over troops at all. Gouverneur K. Warren, the Army's 33-year-old chief engineer, a frail-looking New Yorker, thin-faced and clean-shaven except for a drooped mustache and a tuft of beard just below his lower lip, had ridden over to inspect the hill's defenses at about the same time Meade's brief talk with Sickles was being interrupted by his horse's antic reaction to the rebel cannonade. Disturbed to find the high ground all but unoccupied, despite its obvious tactical value, Warren told the signalmen to keep up their wigwag activity simply as a pretense of alertness, whether they had any real messages to transmit or not, which was why Oates had found him so busy when he looked down at them from across the valley, and quickly notified Meade of the grave danger to his left. Meade passed the word to Sykes, whose corps by now was in motion to reinforce Sickles, and Sykes passed it along to Barnes. Barnes, who at 62 was one of the 2 oldest division commanders in the Army, was not with his troops at the time, but Strong Vincent, who at 26 was the Army's youngest brigade commander, responded by marching at once to occupy the hill. Arriving less than a quarter of an hour before the Texans and Alabamians, he advanced his brigade, 4 regiments from as many different states, Pennsylvania, New York, Maine, and Michigan, to the far side of the crest, well downhill in order to leave room for reinforcements, and took up a stout position in which to wait for what was not long in coming. Warren, meanwhile, had ordered up 2 guns from Charles Hazlett's battery, helping to manhandle them up the rocky incline and onto the summit. This done, he went in search of infantry supports, which he could see were about to be needed badly, and he found Stephen H. Weed's brigade of Ayers' division marching west on the road leading out to the peach orchard, when the commander of the rear regiment, Patrick O'Rourke, by coincidence it was 140th New York, which Warren himself had commanded before he moved up to staff, protested that he and his men were under orders to join Sickles. Warren did not waste time riding to the head of the column to find Weed. "Never mind that, Patty," he said. "Bring 'em up on the double quick and don't stop for a lining. I'll take the responsibility." O'Rourke did as Warren directed, and Weed soon followed with his other 3 regiments, double-timing as best he could up the steep, boulder-clogged incline and over the crest, to find the struggle raging furiously below him on the equally steep and rocky southwest face of the fuming hill. Vincent by then had fallen, shot through the heart as he ranged up and down the firing line. "Don't yield an inch" was his last command, and though his men tried their hardest to do as he said, One officer was to recall that under the influence of no less than 5 charges and countercharges, the edge of the fight swayed back and forward like a wave. The conflict was particularly desperate on the far left, where the 20th Maine, made up of lumberjacks and fishermen under Joshua Chamberlain, a former minister and Bowdoin professor, opposed the 15th Alabama, Oates' own regiment, composed for the most part of farmers. Equally far from home, Presque Isle and Talladega were each 650 crowflight miles from Little Round Top, which lay practically on the line connecting them. The men of these two outfits fought as if the outcome of the battle, and with it the war, depended on their valor, as indeed perhaps it did, since whoever had possession of this craggy height on the Union left would dominate the whole fishhook position. The blood stood in puddles in some places on the rocks, Oates said later. Losses were especially heavy among Federals of rank. O'Rourke, who was barely 23 and an officer of much promise, having been top man in the West Point class of '61, was killed along with more than 24 of his men in the first blast of musketry that greeted his arrival. Weed, coming up behind him with the rest of the brigade, was shot in the head by a sniper down in the Devil's Den, and as Hazlitt, who was standing beside him directing the fire of his 2 guns, bent forward to catch any last words the 29-year-old brigadier might utter, he too was dropped, probably by the same long-range marksman, and fell dead across Weed's body. Casualties on the Confederate side were as heavy, if not heavier, and increased steadily as blue reinforcements continued to come up, unmatched by any on the downhill side. With all but one of the field officers killed or wounded in the Texas regiments, and no replacements anywhere in sight, Major J.C. Rogers, who had succeeded to leadership of the 5th Texas by elimination, might have thought he'd been forgotten by the high command, except that presently a courier from division came up the hillside, dodging from boulder to boulder among the twittering bullets and screaming ricochets. He brought no expected word of reinforcements, but he did have a message from the wounded Hood's successor. General Law presents his compliments, he told Rogers, and says to hold the place at all hazards. This was altogether too much for the hard-pressed major. Compliments, hell, he roared above the clatter of battle. Who wants compliments in such a damn place as this? Go back and ask General Law if he expects me to hold the world in check with the 5th Texas Regiment. Oates could see that the struggle could have but one end if it continued at this rate. 5 regiments fighting uphill against 8 who were supported by artillery in defense of a position he had judged to be nearly impregnable in the first place. So long as there was a hope of reinforcements, he would fight. Return to your companies. We'll sell out as dearly as possible, he had told his captains. But presently, after the courier arrived with nothing more substantial than Law's compliments, he ordered a withdrawal. Just as the word was passed, the Maine men launched a bayonet attack. When the signal was given, we ran like a herd of wild cattle, Oates later admitted. Near the base of the hill, they rallied, being joined by the rest of Law's and Robertson's brigades, together with those of Anderson and Benning, who had succeeded by now in driving the Federals out of the Devil's Den, capturing 3 guns in the process. Not that the fighting had abated. Sykes had brought up 2 of his divisions in support of Sickles, with the result that the odds were as long down here as they'd been above. There on the lower western slopes of Little Round Top, the survivors began collecting rocks of all shapes and sizes, constructing a barricade to fight behind, and all the while the soldiers of both armies kept up a hot fire, banging away at whatever showed itself, or perhaps at nothing at all. Both sides were whipped, the Texas private explained afterwards, and all were mad about it. McLaws was also engaged by now, in part at least, and though this finally helped to relieve the pressure on the men who were fighting for their lives at the base of the rocky hill, the wait had been a long one, Longstreet having held him back in hopes that when he went forward at last he would find the enemy line greatly weakened by the shift of troops to meet Hood's attack on Little Round Top, which after all was not their assigned objective. Such withholding tactics had made possible the one-punch knockout old Peter had scored at 2nd Manassas a year ago next month, and he planned to repeat that coup today. If this was hard on Hood, whose men were thus required to absorb the single-minded attention of the entire Federal left wing for more than an hour, it was not easy on McLaws and his 4 brigade commanders, who were burning to advance. Particularly William Barksdale, whose thirst for glory was as sharp in Pennsylvania as it had been on his great day at Fredericksburg, where Lee, to his delight, had let him challenge the whole Yankee army. From the eastern fringe of the woods in which his troops awaited the signal to move out, the Mississippian could see bluecoats milling about in the peach orchard, as if they had it in mind to advance against him, and a battery posted temptingly at the apex of the salient less than 600 yards away. "General, let me go. General, let me charge," he kept begging McLaws, who declined, being under orders to wait for Corps to inform him when the time was right. Soon Longstreet came riding northward through the woods and drew rein to talk with McLaws. Born within a week of each other 42 years ago, the 2 Georgians had been classmates at West Point. Equally burly of form and shaggy of hair and beard, they even resembled one another, not only in looks but also in their deliberative manner. Barksdale approached them and renewed his plea. "I wish you'd let me go in, General," he appealed to the Corps commander. "I'll take that battery in 5 minutes." Longstreet looked out at the guns in the orchard, then back at the tall, white-maned Mississippian, who was trembling with excitement. Old Peter liked Barksdale, who was half a year his junior but looked older because of the prematurely gray hair worn shoulder length, and greatly admired his spirit, but he would not be hurried. "Wait a little," he said in a calm, deep voice. "We're all going in presently." It was near 5:30 before he gave the signal that opened the secondary attack. McLaws went in as Hood had done, his brigades committed in echelon from the right, which meant that Barksdale had some more waiting to do, being stationed on the left. South Carolinians under J.B. Kershaw, one of the 5 generals the town of Camden was to contribute to the Confederacy before the war was over, went forward with a shout, headed straight for the big wheat field north of the Devil's Den, about midway between Little Round Top and the peach orchard. Longstreet walked out with them as far as the Emmitsburg Road, where he stopped and waved them on with his hat, adding his own deep-throated version of the rebel yell to the tumult. They struck the center of Birney's division, which was posted behind a low stone wall along the near edge of the shimmering field of wheat, with Barnes's 2 remaining brigades in close support. As the fighting mounted swiftly toward a climax, Paul J. Sams, younger brother of Alabama's captain, brought his Georgians out to join the stand-up fight, and behind them came a 3rd brigade, still more Georgians, under W.T. Wofford, who had led them since the death of Tom Cobb in the sunken road at Fredericksburg. The Union line began to crumble under this added pressure, men dropping all along it and others scrambling rearward to get a head start in the race for safety. Just then Sams fell mortally wounded, which resulted in some confusion among his troops, but the loss was overbalanced at this critical point by one on the other side. Sickles was riding his line, erect on horseback, ignoring the whistle of bullets and the scream of shells, until one of the latter came along that could not be ignored because it struck his right leg just above the knee and left it hanging in shreds. He fell heavily to the ground, but kept cool enough to save his life by ordering a tourniquet improvised from a saddle strap. As he lay there, pale from the sudden loss of blood, his thigh bone protruding stark white against the red of mangled flesh, a staff officer rode up and asked solicitously, if superfluously, "General, are you hurt?" Normally, Sickles would have laughed at the simplicity of the question, but not now. "Tell General Birney he must take command," he replied. Lifted onto a stretcher, he heard through the waves of pain and shock that a rumor was being spread that he was dead. So he called the bearers to a halt while one of them lit a cigar for him, then rode the rest of the way to the aid station with it clamped at a jaunty angle between his teeth, puffing industriously at it by way of disproving the rumor that he had stopped breathing. Thus did old Dan Sickles leave the war to proceed in time to other fields of endeavor, including a well-publicized liaison with the deposed nymphomaniac Queen of Spain. There was to be a great deal of discussion, beginning tonight and continuing down the years, as to whether his occupation of the salient, half a mile and more in front of the main Union line, had been a colossal blunder or a tactically sound maneuver. Whatever else it was or wasn't, and entirely aside from the fact that it helped to discourage Longstreet's men from attacking as Lee had ordered straight up the Emmitsburg Road, which probably would have meant utter destruction for them if Sickles had stayed back on the ridge to tear their flank as they went by. The movement resulted at any rate in the wrecking of his corps, whose two divisions, formerly under Phil Kearny and Joe Hooker, and therefore among the most famous in the Army, were to suffer well over 4,000 casualties in the 2 hours before sunset. The worst of the damage occurred when the line gave way at the western rim of the wheat field. "It is too hot, my men cannot stand it," Barnes cried, and he ordered a retreat. Birney's were quick to follow despite his efforts to stop them, but as the elated Confederates started forward in close and hot pursuit, they were met by a fresh division under Caldwell, whom Hancock had alerted to stand by for trouble after predicting, quite accurately as it turned out, that Sickles' troops would come tumbling back from the salient. Caldwell struck with all his strength, holding nothing in reserve. And now, though he lost 3 of his 4 brigade commanders, 2 of them killed on contact, it was the rebels who fell back through the trampled grain, the steam gone out of their drive. From Little Round Top to the northern edge of the wheat field, the fighting degenerated into a bloody squabble as regiment fought regiment, alternately driving and being driven. "What the hell is there down in that valley?" a Federal lieutenant exclaimed after viewing the carnage from up on Cemetery Ridge. Birney's men were out of it by then, such as remained uncaptured and alive, and now the turn had come of those with Humphreys in the orchard and strung out along the road northeast of there. Longstreet's presently had begun to seem interminable to Barksdale and his soldiers, held under cover and straining at the leash all the time the other 3 brigades were taking on most of Birney's and Barnes's divisions, and finally all of Caldwell's, which came in fresh to stop them short of the ridge. Though opinion was divided as to the distinguishing characteristics of these troops from the Deep South, the Virginia artilleryman, for example, having learned to feel secure whenever his battery had the support of the Mississippians, was to say that theirs was the brigade I knew and loved best of all in Lee's army, whereas a Chambersburg civilian, observing the various rebel outfits that passed through his town, decided quite to the contrary, that those from Mississippi and Texas were more vicious and defiant than the rest. The men themselves not only would have considered both of these remarks complimentary, but also would have been hard put to say which compliment they preferred. Certainly their viciousness and defiance were apparent to the Federals in the orchard, just over a quarter-mile away, as they came running eastward out of the woods, unleashed at last and eager to come to grips. Barksdale was out in front of the whole line, his face radiant with joy, as one observer remarked, to be leading what a Confederate lieutenant and a Union colonel referred to afterwards, respectively, as the most magnificent charge I witnessed during the war and the grandest charge that was ever made by mortal man. His earlier assurance that he could take that battery in 5 minutes had sounded overconfident at the time, mainly because the stout rail fences on both sides of the Emmitsburg Road seemed likely to slow his advance while they were being torn down or climbed over. As it turned out, however, the fences were no deterrent at all. They simply vanished under the impact of the charging Mississippians, who reached the peach orchard even sooner than their general had predicted, whooping with delight as they swarmed over the battery and such of its defenders as had resisted the impulse to get out of the path of that savage assault. 4 of the guns and close to 1,000 prisoners were taken in one swoop, but that was only a part of what Barksdale was after. Still out front, hatless so that his long white hair streamed behind him as he ran, he shouted, "Forward, men, forward," pointing with his sword at the blue line half a mile ahead on Cemetery Ridge. He did not make it that far, nor did any of his men. A Federal brigadier, watching the conspicuous figure draw nearer across the stony floor of the valley, assigned a whole company of riflemen the task of bringing him down, which they did. As for his men, The vigilant Hunt had prepared a reception for them by massing 40 guns along the crest and down the slope of the ridge. Meade had seen to it that these batteries had infantry support by shifting troops southward from his overcrowded right, but the guns themselves, blasting the attackers wholesale as they came within easy range, turned out to be enough. Still they came on, overrunning the first line of artillery on the slope where the cannoneers fought them with pistols and rammer-staffs and whatever came to hand, and all the while the guns on the crest flung canister point blank at them, mangling blue and gray alike. Finally, unsupported on the left or right, Barksdale's men fell back westward to a line along Plum Run, midway between the road and the ridge, leaving half their number dead or wounded on the field, including their commander. Scouts from a Vermont regiment were to bring him into their lines that night, shot through both legs and the breast, and he would die by morning, his thirst for glory slaked at last. Hood and McLaws had done their worst, and the 15,000 men in their 8 brigades, having taken on 6 full enemy divisions, together with major portions of 3 others, a total of 22 Federal brigades disposed with all the advantages of the defensive and containing better than twice as many troops as came against them, were fought to a standstill along an irregular line stretching northwest from the Round Tops to the Peach Orchard, anywhere from half a mile to a mile beyond the Emmitsburg Road, which had marked the line of departure. Proud of what his soldiers had accomplished against the odds, though he knew that it was less than Lee had hoped for, Longstreet was to say, "I do not hesitate to pronounce this the best 3 hours fighting ever done by any troops on any battlefield." The cost had been great. More than a third of the men in the 2 divisions had been hit. Hood would be out of combat for some time, a grievous loss, and Semmes and Barksdale forever. But so had been the gain, not so much in actual ground, though that had been considerable, as in its effect of setting the bluecoats up for the kill. Meade had been stripping his center along with his right to reinforce his left, and now the offensive passed to Hill, or more specifically to Richard Anderson, whose division was on the right, adjoining McLaws, and who now took up his portion of the echelon attack from a position directly opposite the weakened Union center. In this, as in the other 2 divisional attacks, the brigades would be committed in sequence from the right, and it opened with all the precision of a maneuver on the drill field. Nor was any such delay as there'd been in the case of McLaws, held in check by Longstreet while Hood's men were storming the Devil's Den and fighting for their lives on Little Round Top. At 6:20, when Barksdale survivors began their withdrawal from the shell-swept western slope of Cemetery Ridge, Anderson sent Cadmus Wilcox and his Alabamians driving hard for a section of the ridge just north of where the Mississippians had struck and been repulsed. Next in line, David Lang's small brigade of 3 Florida regiments followed promptly, supported in turn by Ambrose Wright's Georgians, who came forward on the left. But that was where the breakdown of the echelon plan began. Colonel Posey, having already committed 3 of his 4 Mississippi regiments as skirmishers, had not understood that he was to charge with the 4th, and his doubts became even graver when he discovered that his left would not be covered by William Mahone, who could not be persuaded that his Virginia brigade, posted all day in reserve, was intended to have a share in the attack. Wilcox by now had sent his adjutant back to ask for reinforcements, and Anderson had sent him on to Mahone with full approval of the request. But Mahone refused to budge. "I have my orders from General Anderson himself to stay here," he kept insisting, despite the staff man's protest that it was the division commander who had sent him. As a result, Posey advanced his single regiment only as far as the Emmitsburg Road, where he came under heavy artillery fire, and Wright, after pausing briefly to give the 2 laggard brigades a chance to catch up and cover his left, went on alone when he saw that the Mississippians would come no farther and that the Virginians had no intention of advancing at all. The fault was primarily Anderson's. Missing the firm, if sometimes heavy hand of Longstreet, under whom he'd always fought before, except at Chancellorsville, where Lee himself had taken him in charge, he was unaccustomed to Hill's comparatively light touch, which allowed him to be less attentive to preparatory details. Furthermore, Hill had understood that his right division was more or less detached to Longstreet, whereas Longstreet had interpreted Lee's instructions merely to mean that Hill would be in support and therefore still in command of his own troops. Consequently, neither exercised any control over Anderson, who followed suit by leaving the conduct of the attack to his subordinates, with the result that it broke down in mid-career. At this point, however, with Wilcox, Lang, and Wright driving hard for Cemetery Ridge, the question of blame seemed highly inappropriate. A more likely question seemed to concern a proper distribution of praise among the three attacking brigades for having pierced the Union center. Hancock certainly saw it in that light, and with good cause. Meade having placed him in command of the 3rd Corps as well as his own when Sickles fell, he had sent one of his 3 divisions to reinforce the left an hour ago, and since then had been using elements of the 2 remaining divisions to bolster the line along Plum Run, where McLaws was keeping up the pressure. As a result, he'd found neither the time nor the means to fill the gap on his left, where Caldwell had been posted until his departure, and the even larger gap that had yawned beyond it ever since Sickles moved out to occupy the salient. To his horror, Hancock now saw that Wilcox was headed directly for this soft spot, driving the remnant of Humphreys' division pell-mell before him as he advanced, with Lang on his left and Wright on the left of Lang. Gambling that no simultaneous attack would be launched against his right, just below Cemetery Hill, Hancock ordered Gibbon and Hayes to double time southward along the ridge and use what was left of their commands to plug the gap the rebels were about to strike. He hurried in that direction ahead of his troops and arrived in time to witness the final rout of Humphreys, whose men were in full flight by now, with Wilcox close on their heels and driving hard for the scantily defended ridge beyond. As he himself climbed back up the slope on horseback under heavy fire from the attackers, Hancock wondered how he was going to stop or even delay them long enough for a substantial line of defense to be formed on the high ground. Gibbon and Hayes had been ordered up and were coming on the run, he later explained, but I saw that in some way 5 minutes must be gained or we were lost. Just then the lead regiment of Gibbon's 1st Brigade came over the crest in a column of 4s, and Hancock saw a chance to gain those 5 minutes, though at a cruel price. "What regiment is this?" he asked the officer at the head of the column moving toward him down the slope. "1st Minnesota, its commander, William Colville replied. Hancock nodded. "Colonel, do you see those colors?" As he spoke, he pointed at the Alabama flag in the front rank of the charging rebels. Colville said he did. "Then take 'em," Hancock told him. Quickly, although scarcely a man among them could have failed to see what was being asked of him, the Minnesotans deployed on the slope, 8 companies of them at any rate. 3 others had been detached as skirmishers, leaving 262 men present for duty, and charging headlong down it, bayonets fixed, struck the center of the long gray line. Already in some disorder as a result of their run of nearly a mile over stony ground and against such resistance as Humphreys had managed to offer, the Confederates recoiled briefly, then came on again, yelling fiercely as they concentrated their fire on this one undersized blue regiment. The result was devastating. Colville and all but 3 of his officers were killed or wounded, together with 215 of his men. The captain brought the 47 survivors back up the ridge, less than 1/5 as many as had charged down it. They had not taken the Alabama flag, but they had held on to their own, and they had given Hancock his 5 minutes, plus 5 more for good measure. Those 10 minutes were enough. By the time Wilcox reached the foot of the ridge, with Lang bringing up his 3 regiments on the left, Gibbon's division had taken position on the crest and was pouring heavy volleys of musketry into the ranks of both brigades from dead ahead. Staggered by this, and torn on his unprotected right by fire from the masked batteries that had repulsed Barksdale half an hour before, Wilcox looked back across the valley and saw that his appeal for reinforcements had not been answered. Regretfully, he ordered a retreat. So did Lang at the same time, and as the Alabamians and Floridians began their withdrawal from the base of the ridge, Wright's Georgians struck with irresistible force some 400 yards to the north. On they came like the fury of a whirlwind, a Pennsylvania captain later recalled.